On March 3rd, 1955, in a small coal mining community in western Kentucky called Greenville, Mr. Lovell, John Joseph Lovell IV, was born in a hospital for the cost of $25. Mr. Lovell would be the only child born to Bonnie Catherine Lovell and John Joseph Lovell III. Bonnie was a stay-at-home mom and a writer. She liked to write old-time stories and poetry. Mr. Lovell's father worked in the coal mines for 22 years before going to college at the age of 41. His dream was to become a teacher, but as fate would have it, he became a social worker. Mr. Lovell's father also ran a Boy Scout troop for 35 years. What was it like growing up in Greenville? How is it different from today?
Well, Greenville was and still is a small town. Back in the 1950s, when I was growing up there, we played outdoors a lot. One way that's different from today is that most of us did not have air conditioning. So our homes were not air conditioned, so it was actually cooler to be outside where you could get some breeze. So all of the kids in the neighborhood played outdoors in the summertime from sun up to sundown. And we ran in the woods and played games in the woods. We used our imaginations. We played traditional games like baseball and basketball and kick the can and dodgeball and things like that. As I got older, I worked in a local grocery store, and I started when I was 14. And I guess the thing that I remember most about that is that in terms of the economy of our little town, everything closed down on Sundays. And that's a big change from the way life is today. On the door of our grocery store, it had the hours and each day that we were open. On Sunday it said, closed, see you in church. So nothing was open on Sundays, and everyone was in church.
How did your parents influence your desire to teach?
Mom and Dad didn't necessarily encourage me to be a teacher, but they encouraged me to make a difference in the world. Mom used to say, leave footprints on the sands of time. And that was a quote that she would often say to me. She sang in the church choir for 50 years. Dad was a scout leader for 35 years. So I grew up with a strong desire to be of service to my fellow man.
The 1960s were known for the British invasion, the March on Washington, JFK's assassination, Woodstock, and the Cold War. This was the setting for Mr. Lovell's elementary and middle school years when he was a student at Greenville Elementary School. In 1960, Mr. Lovell started kindergarten and fondly remembers his kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Leila Gross.
What was your kindergarten year like?
Well, first of all, you need to understand that most kids back in those days didn't go to kindergarten. Many of my classmates, their first experience with formal education was the first day of first grade. So I was fortunate to be able to go to kindergarten, and it was a private kindergarten at my church. And the minister's wife, Leila Gross, was my kindergarten teacher. And I have images in my mind of Miss Gross doing crazy things, like she hid under a pile of leaves out behind the church and then exploded out of the leaf pile and scared us all. I remember that. I remember my first experience with painting, and we used watercolors on butcher paper on large easels, and that was a lot of fun. My very first field trip, and really only one of two field trips, we held onto a rope and walked down the street to the fire station to see the fire engine. So I had a wonderful experience in kindergarten.
During this time, Mr. Lovell became a Boy Scout, going on to earn his Eagle status in 1971. In addition, Mr. Lovell's love of music began during this decade, and he started a garage band called Stillwaters in 1969, which he played the rhythm guitar. You often use music in class. What caused your love of music?
I would have to say three things caused my love of music. First, I was raised in the church, and the great hymns of the church are a part of me. My mom introduced me to classical music when I was just a little bitty boy. She had a vast record collection, and so I was listening to Bach and Beethoven and Vivaldi from the time I was born. I remember standing on the coffee table in the living room and directing my pretend orchestra. In a totally different genre, My dad introduced me to country and western, cowboy music and bluegrass music, old-time music. He played the guitar, and every day when he came home from the coal mines, he would sit on the edge of his bed and play his 1938 Gibson guitar, and I would crawl up behind him on the bed and put my ear against the end of his guitar and listen to every one of those songs. And after a while, he would roll the chords and tell me what chord it was. This is an E chord, this is a G chord. And so I learned every note and every chord. And so from Mom and Dad and the church, I learned to love music. I think music opens up a window in your soul, a window in your mind that just allows you to experience things on a totally different level. And I do use music in class with, for instance, the Vietnam War. I may show a video of the Kent State shootings and play a song by Neil Young entitled Ohio, and then have the kids analyze the lyrics to try to figure out who was Nixon and what was this war about and why were students so opposed to it. And I think they'll remember that a lot longer because of the music.
Mr. Lovell graduated from Greenville High School in 1973. From there, he enrolled in Hopkinsville Community College, which he attended in 1973 to 1974. He then transferred to Murray State University in August in 1974. He earned his bachelor's degree in psychology in 1977. Although his degree was in psychology, his first job was teaching English and reading. He taught these in a private school in Mayfield, Kentucky. At this point, he went back to Murray and earned his master's degree. What important things did you learn while teaching at your first school?
My first teaching job was at a small private school. It was non-graded, and the students were not grouped according to age. They were grouped according to their reading ability. I was 21 years old, and I had a student who was 20, and I had many students who were 17 and 18 years old. So I wasn't much older than the students. My first mistake was to try to be one of the gang, or to be their buddy, which just didn't work. My discipline was not particularly good. So I learned right off the bat that it's great to be friendly with the students, but you can't try to be their buddy. The second lesson I learned was you need to always start where the students are. I came in with my expectations here, and the students were here, and very quickly they became frustrated with my instruction, and then they became annoyed, and then they stopped working for me. So I learned that I needed to start where they were and try to build them to their potential. And a third thing that I learned that I thought was very important that first year was never tell a student that something's going to be easy, because if they try their best and they're not successful, they're going to feel dumb, and teachers don't have the right to let students feel dumb. So I always tell my students, first day, you are not allowed to feel dumb in my class. If you have a question, feel free to ask it, and no one's going to laugh at your question. And if you don't understand, then I'll try different ways to try to get you to understand it. And if I'm not successful, maybe I'll get a student in the class to try to explain it. So we'll all work together to make sure that no one is left behind. So those were some of the lessons that I learned my first year of teaching.
Did you know you were going to become an elementary teacher at this point of your career?
Actually, at that point in my life, I was going to work with older students because I had been working with older students. So I went back to Murray State and got a master's degree in reading and higher education. And I did work the next 4 years with older students who struggled with their reading and were not really prepared for college. So at that point, no, I wasn't thinking about teaching elementary school. I was thinking about teaching older students.
In August of 1980, Mr. Lovell joined the faculty at Murray State University, where he taught reading and study skills at the MSU Learning Center. Mr. Lovell continued to teach at MSU until 1984. During this time, he married and had his only son, Charles Benjamin Lovell, or better known as Ben. He then moved to Frankfort and began teaching in the Franklin County school system in August of 1984. His first teaching position was as a 5th grade social studies teacher at Hearn Elementary School. What was it like teaching elementary students for the first time?
It was hard. I was used to the private school, and even at Murray State, I was used to small groups. And so for the first time I had larger groups of students, 30 or 32 in a class, and I was not quite prepared for the demands of the public school. So there were lots of things in terms of the administration and the paperwork that I needed to learn.
How have your teaching methods changed over the years?
Soon after I started teaching elementary school, I discovered something that helps make things go a lot easier, and that's humor. And so I started using humor in my class a lot. In just one afternoon, I came up with 50 silly stories to teach my students about the 50 states. And I still have people who are in their 30s that stop me on the street and say, "Hey, Mr. Lovell, I still remember those stories about the 50 states." So I learned early on that humor can be a way to help kids learn things and retain the information for a long time. And it's kind of like a little sugar helps the medicine go down. And so if I have something to teach, if I can use humor, it just makes it that much easier.
After Hearn, Mr. Lovell switched gears and went to Elkhorn Middle School. He taught 6th graders and 8th graders through 1993 to 2000.
Mr. Lovell transferred to the Old Peaks Middle School, where he taught for 2 years, before it closed. He then taught at the New Peaks Mill for an additional 2 years.
Mr. Lovell transferred to Westridge Elementary in 2004. He has been teaching here for 10 years and continues to teach today.
Mr. Lovell is well liked at Westridge Elementary, also known for his storytelling.
His stories range from humorous to sad, but always teach a lesson. Some of his most memorable stories are about the 50 states.
My personal favorite is the Rhode Island story with its teeny tiny library and its teeny tiny librarian.
A lot of former students tell me that their favorite part of my class was when I taught them about the 50 states, just to identify the 50 states. And I started out just using a rote drill kind of method, which wasn't particularly successful. And then one afternoon I sat down and came up with 50 silly little stories or rhymes or songs to help the kids remember the 50 states. I'll do one. And I always like to connect as many states as possible in my stories. So for Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho, it makes a V, and the principal of my school at the time was Mr. Vickers, and he's a very tall man, he's about 6'7". And I tell the story about how on the very first day of school, the little kindergarten kids would run into the school and they would see Mr. Vickers for the first time. And they were only this tall. And they would look up at Mr. Vickers and they would tug on his pants and say, why are you so tall? So I use that in this little story. So if you start with Wyoming and take the first part of Wyoming, and you go to Utah, it would be a little kid pulling on Mr. Vickers' pants, saying, why Utah? And Mr. Vickers would look down at the little kids and say, Idaho. It would be, I don't know. And so for years and years, Mr. Vickers would tell me that he would see students out in town and they would pull on his pant leg and say, Mr. Vickers, why Utah? And he would say, Idaho.
Mr. Lovell is not only loved by the Western students, he has received many awards during his career.
Mr. Lovell was selected for the Academic Faculty Award 6 times before they discontinued the program. He also received the We the People Award.
He was inducted into the KAAC Hall of Fame in 2010 for his 27 years of coaching academic teams.
In 2010, Mr. Lovell received the National Boards in Social Studies.
He was selected Teacher of the Year at Westridge in 2010. Mr. Lovell has made a huge impact on thousands of students' lives over his 35 years of teaching.
To close, let's hear a few words from Mr. Lovell himself.
In the summer of 1984, I interviewed for a position with the Franklin County School System. And I underwent a long and laborious interview, a 60-question taped interview called the SRI Procedure. I'll always remember the first question, which was, Mr. Lovell, why do you want to be a teacher? and my response was, I want to make a difference in the lives of children. This undoubtedly came from my mom and dad, and I watched my entire life as they gave of themselves and tried to make the world a better place. When I was a little boy, I dug through a scrapbook of my dad's, and I found a poem called 100 Years From Now. And I don't know exactly how the poem goes, but in my mind, my version is 100 years from now, it won't matter what kind of car I drove, what kind of house I lived in, how much money I had in the bank, or what kind of clothes I wore. But the world may be a different place, a better place, because I was important in the life of a child.